The following clip explores the measures that countries and stakeholders can take to cut carbon emissions. To reach our 2 degrees goal, we can only emit about another 1,000 billion tons of CO2 in total. As we emit nearly 40 billion tons annually at present, that means we have less than 30 years left. Currently, all known existing reserves are already 3 times bigger than those we can burn if we are determined to hit the 2 degrees goal. For investors, it may become uneconomic to put money into exploring fossil fuels if new climate policies are pushed through. Coal is at present the world's most important source of energy after oil. It has helped improve people's lifestyles for centuries. It may not be easy to reduce its consumption quickly or cheaply, as industries and people still rely on it. On the other hand, coal is a major source of carbon dioxide. Policy can take several approaches to reduce carbon emissions, for example by introducing carbon pricing. Carbon pricing can come in 2 broad forms. Several countries apply a tax per ton of CO2 emissions from burning fossil fuels. Governments set the tax rate and the cost of carbon emissions, but they do not set the amount of carbon emissions. The second scheme involves emission trading. Companies receive a fixed quota of emission permits and can either cut their emissions or buy extra permits. Since governments set the quota, they can determine the exact amount of emissions. Both carbon taxes and emissions trading increase energy prices, which may make them unpopular. Many countries support the use of fossil fuels by giving subsidies to fossil fuel producers. By selling energy below its market price, they lead to wasteful use of fossil fuels. Eliminating such subsidies could therefore be a very effective measure to reduce CO2 emissions. Another way for countries to cut carbon emissions would be to subsidize low-carbon sources of energy, including renewable energy such as wind, solar, and hydropower. These energy forms can reduce carbon emissions, air pollution, and imports of fossil fuels. Other forms of low-carbon power such as biomass and nuclear power may be more controversial. Nuclear power produces radioactive waste, and biomass may compete with food crops for land. Until now, subsidies have not been cheap, as wind and solar power were often more expensive than fossil fuels. But global growth in manufacturing and innovation has cut costs, making them much more competitive. Investing in energy efficiency can also reduce our consumption of fossil fuels. In fact, governments have already successfully achieved energy savings by setting standards for more efficient cars, light bulbs, and appliances. One focus area could be to cut the energy consumption of appliances such as televisions left on standby. Standby energy accounts for 10% of global household electricity use. People do not have to wait for governments to take action on climate change. On a subnational level, businesses and investors can use low-carbon technologies and boost energy efficiency. Cities can make low-carbon choices, such as developing public transport and cycle lanes and making buildings more energy efficient. Policymakers have to take into account the cost of their decisions to fight climate change. Economists suggest that cutting carbon emissions will only cost a small fraction of the amount of economic growth expected by the end of this century. Estimating the cost of climate change is far more difficult. Much of the damage will happen in the far future, and so is complicated to measure. Time is pressing. If emission rates cannot be reduced very soon, CO2 may even have to be taken out of the atmosphere and stored somehow, somewhere in future. That is a technology only nature has offered so far through forests.